Start the recording. Awesome. So I'm here with Vanessa Garcia, who is looking to break into the game industry, wanted to answer some questions. She had checked out the YouTube channel, and hopefully that was somewhat helpful. And so you saw the guide that
I
I
saw
wrote?
the guide, yes. I got
Okay,
a link
awesome.
to
So I'm working
that.
on that. That's going to be linked in the description of the video. That's sort of like how to break into the games industry 101. It's a little bit focused towards designers and engineers though, and you had told me that
Right.
you're interested in the production side. So I'm interested in where it might have failed you in that regard because I'd love to improve it. But yeah, just beyond that, let me know what other stuff I can help with. Of course, I'm not a producer, right? So I can't speak exactly to that, but I'm happy to answer any questions I can.
For sure. Yeah, I would say it was helpful, at least in giving me an overview of those realms in game dev. I will say that when I started seeing like those keywords of like for dev or for design, I was like, oh shoot, maybe this is not like super specific to product and or production.
Sure.
But I still was excited to get like some, general tips about, the interview questions and like looking at listings and whatnot.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of tailor the resume and whatnot. So that was super helpful in that regard.
So, the best book for like coding interviews is called Cracking the Coding Interview. But
Mm.
the same author wrote this book called Cracking the PM Interview.
Does it have a little alarm clock
I think so,
on it?
yeah.
I think I've like briefly looked
You
at
read
that
it? Was
book.
it you? Was it useful? Did you? Because the coding one's really good. Is the PM one any good? I haven't checked it out.
I would say in terms of like if you so I had a friend lend me that book the day before I had an interview with PlayStation for a product management internship.
Okay.
And I was not sure what I was going to get, but I was thinking there might be an estimation question. There might be, the general product questions of like, what is product? Why do you want to get into it? And the book really helped me have a holistic approach to all of that because they had everything from the estimation like frameworks to the like how to prepare your about me segment, but then also kind of like figuring out like what exactly is product if you're coming it from that internship perspective. And at that time I was looking at internships for product, but now I'm doing product in healthcare, so that's been like an interesting journey. But long story short, that book was pretty helpful.
What questions did you get on your interview with PlayStation or some other
So
like
I
video
did
game?
get, yeah, I
What's been
did
the
get an
challengingest ones also?
Yeah, because I got like my first screening interview. They looked at my resume and they were just like asking questions about like positions and the impact that I had, and so it was good to be ready with that. Just having like the exact quantitative impact stats ready offhand in terms of like, for example, they were like, okay, it seems that you worked on building notifications for the app, but like how did that increase engagement? And I had to say, oh, X, Y, and Z engagement, blah blah blah. But then at the end, and this is like pretty infamous for me, I had prepared for estimations, but I was still very nervous. And so when they asked me the question, how would you estimate how many football fields there are in the United States?
Hmm.
I started panicking regardless of my preparation. And I think that was just a me thing. I'm openly neurodivergent. I struggle with anxiety, and I just kind of like panicked and blanked and lost every framework that I had practiced, kind of went out the window. But after that, it was a learning process of being like, okay, maybe have like your like cheat sheet like right next to you,
Right.
especially since it was a phone call
Yeah.
screening this one. And then as I got to the second round interview, they asked me questions about my involvement with. So I went, I went to Brown, and I was on Brown Esports as the diversity and inclusion representative and also the social media director. And at the time, I was just sharing my involvement there, and they were interested in that because they were like, okay, do you game? Do you not game? Like, it's okay if you don't, but like, we're just curious. And I was like, I do these kinds of games and others I don't, but I'm kind of interested in coming in from that perspective of like a community gamer. And I can elaborate on what that means further down the interview, but I basically then told them about that, and they asked me a lot of. I think the project manager also was interviewing me in the second round. I had 3 interviews in the second round. It was with the engineering lead, the project manager, and I'm forgetting the first individual, but it was like people who would be working on the team.
So
Um,
and So in terms of the questions, though, you would say the hardest ones was kind of like those estimation frameworks.
Yeah, the qualitative ones, I was comfortable. I was fine. I wouldn't call them like they are quantitative, but like estimation particularly
Yeah.
struggled a lot
Well,
with that.
part of your story I really empathize with because like I've done this interview process so many times at different companies, and I still have moments where they ask me the question and like I don't know the answer right away, and you do get that whole like the pressure of like, oh shit, like am I an idiot? Do I not know what I'm doing? Um, I think
Exactly.
one thing that I've been told that has helped me a little bit in processing that is some people will say like they're not there necessarily to know if you know the answer right away, especially if you're coming in as
Mhm.
anything less than senior. We're
Right.
both relatively in the start of our careers, so if somebody says like, oh, what's this, and you don't know the exact answer, that's okay. What they're trying to test is, are you somebody who's going to be a good fit for the team and a good learner? And
Right.
if tell them what you do know, be very audible, explain the process that you're going through, and then they will kind of fill in the details and like so I think that's really like they're evaluating your process, and one of the things they like is actually to see you maybe fail so they can help correct you, because some people are like kind of jerks if you correct them, so it's good to assess that, like to see,
Mm.
oh, are they um are they good at receiving feedback, and like if I tell them, oh, change your approach a little bit. I remember there was this one antagonistic interview I had heard of. Maybe it seemed like a bit of a parable, right? But apparently this happened in real life, where somebody was like, "Oh, what's the color of Mario's hat?" or something like that, and the design candidate had to say like, "Oh, yeah, Mario's hat, like that's red," and then the guy's like, "No, no, it's blue," and like they're like intentionally telling him the wrong thing because they want to see like how does he react to like antagonism, and like, oh, no, no, you're totally wrong, like I remember it this way, which I thought
Right.
was interesting.
That is
I
super
doubt that
interesting.
happened in real life, but if it did
Right.
happen, it'd be because I feel like that's just naturally going to occur from like a result of like you going one way with an approach or you going a different way, and something
Yeah.
I try to approach the questions with the intentionality of like, oh, I don't necessarily, they have the right answer in mind, probably. Maybe not so much for the estimations, but in general, they have a path they want you to see you take. And so
Right.
what I'll do is I'll often give answers that are like probing with respect to, is this the direction you want me to take? So for example, like if they ask me the football thing, I might say, well, my approach would probably be to think about the U.S. in terms of regions. Like maybe there's 50
Mhm.
states. Puerto Rico, let's say 51 states if you want to include that. And then
Mhm.
I might try to start estimating how many football fields or how many cities are an average, because I'll say maybe one football field per city. So is that kind of the a reasonable approach you think I should start taking as I start thinking about this problem? And then they'll at that point say, "Oh no, you're way off. You probably want to think about this instead." Or
Mhm.
they'll be like,
Mhm.
"Yeah, that sounds good to me," right?
Right.
And
Right.
usually they'll be like, "Oh, I can't give feedback," and if they say, "Oh, I can't say," then that means you're going in the right direction, right? Because if they know you're
Yeah.
wrong, they'll tell you. They'll tell you like, "No, no, no,
They
no, no."
probably want to help you.
Right?
Yeah.
They won't tell
Most.
you if you're going the right way, but if you pause and you ask, then they'll help you. Because the thing is, if you don't pause and ask, usually they wait until you get stumped and circle back. But you could kind of, as a bit of a hack, you can ask them to affirm your
Mhm.
guess, your approximation, and if that's the case, then they won't go down that path, right? And that's the same for coding interviews too. Like this is
Mhm.
just a general interview skill. They know the right answer, so you want to probe to kind of get that thing. So often, if I'm programming, I'll be like, okay, well, here's my rough approach before I code anything, and I'll be like, does that seem good? And they'll be like, well, what about this one edge case? You might want to consider that before you code anything.
Right.
And I'll be like, oh, okay, save myself 5 minutes there, right? Which on a 60-minute interview, could add up. So
For
that,
sure.
that that comes to mind immediately. Well,
Yeah, that
yeah,
makes a
man.
lot of sense. Yeah.
So did you pass any interviews yet, or do you have are you looking at options yet, or you're still in that interview phase right now?
I'm actually still in like the informational interview phase where I've
Got
been
it.
cold reaching out to people and just to get more like insight, like I have done with you.
Yeah.
And in terms of like actually sending out um, job applications, I am waiting to kind of revamp my resume and my narrative first
Yeah.
before I send anything out. And then I'm like, oh, actually, I wish I framed it this way, or I wish I like had these keywords and I didn't. And so I'm trying to be a lot more intentional with this process than I was a year ago. And a year ago, even though like it was funny, like without a referral, it was like literally a LinkedIn application that I sent in. I got that PlayStation thing in advance to the final round and whatnot, but didn't make it through the final round. And then from that day, like a year ago, I just couldn't stop thinking about it in terms of like what would have gotten me through to the like to an offer, and like what was like and I couldn't ask for feedback because in the rejection email they were specifically like, we do not provide feedback,
Right.
but thank
Yeah.
you, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, oh, I just really want to know what was that one thing that got me, I was able to get through all these rounds successfully, but then right at the end, what happened there. And my final round interview, I don't remember anything particularly strange, except for there was a brain teaser question at the very end,
Right.
where she said, there's, this is kind of a strange question, but we want to ask you this. If you were being asked to design a remote and it could only have 2 buttons, what is your process for designing that remote? And I won't tell you my answer necessarily because I think that's boring, but it was I answered it I actually wasn't freaking out at this point because I felt really good in the interview and so far. And I thought I had like a really good process of like explaining it in a product-y kind of way. And maybe that was where I went wrong, but I don't know. I have no idea. And so that's kind of where that ultimately landed there. And now I'm going at it again. I'm going to the Game Developers Conference at the end of March this month. Yeah. And I'm just kind of like, I'm not trying to necessarily like do the break-in kind of action because I think that can be very unprofessional. In fact, I had someone, when I worded it that way, I had a developer tell me that was an unprofessional way to phrase things. And so I've been saying, I'm trying to pivot into the industry from a product-focused position, and that has like felt a lot more authentic because only one person told me they had a problem with the phrase break-in,
right?
But he had a lot of experience, experience at Sony. I started his own company, and I was like,
hear the phrase so much, break in. They're like,
exactly, and I used it in the context of like why I was going to the conference, and he was like, yeah, like you can't just go there to like break in and like chat to people to like just do that. And I totally agree. Actually, at first I was a little like, oh no, like I've offended him, but he wasn't really offended. He was just trying to steer me in the right direction. So.
Oh man, yeah. If people are gonna get offended no matter what. That's this industry. This industry is, sometimes they're not very rugged. So it's just but you want to be respectful at the same time. So But if it's gonna happen. Okay, you said a bunch of things that definitely piqued my interest. So the first thing was about the interviews. I would say look at the laws because it depends on what state you're in. But if you can record the interview secretly, I would say do it. If that's not legal in whatever state you're taking the interview from, immediately after the interview, write down every question you got and to the best of your ability, every answer you did. If you had to type it in any format, copy, paste it, save it to your computer because years down the line, you're going to want to review these. And, the unfortunate truth is a lot of these companies, they don't change the questions too often, right? Particularly, it's a per interview kind of thing. And if one interviewer likes a question, he'll ask it for years. And if you're applying to Sony or PlayStation, whatever it was, a year later, people move around a bit in this industry, but you'll be surprised. An interviewer, you might run into him. That's happened to me. I've run into the same guy 2 years later, and he's got the same question, right? So, geez, man, am I happy I wrote it down, right? So definitely make sure you're doing that. The next thing is, after the questions, after the interview, I would totally recommend asking for feedback. Because this is a great thing in general because it shows growth mindset, especially if you got the question wrong. Think about how you're going to phrase it. I wouldn't come up with it in the moment. Maybe have a canned question, but just off the cuff, I'm thinking it might come across something like, "Hey, that last question was a good challenge for me. Thanks for helping me out in this section. I'm curious, what would be some factors I didn't consider that you think I definitely should have? And what's another way you would have recommended I should have considered approaching this problem, right? So I'm saying, how did I suck, right? How can I have done better, right? You want to ask that stuff, and you could somewhat measure how good your answer was by to what degree there was a delta from their idealized answer, right? If they say, oh, you didn't think about this, and that, then it's like, okay, that's my dearth. So that's what you got to fix.
For sure.
Yeah, asking for that. Oh, the next thing famous quote from Silicon Valley. They say, if you want investment, ask for advice. If you ask for investment, you're only going to get advice. So the way this applies to your narrative you explained earlier is, maybe asking people to break in might come across as, hey, pal, do me a favor. I would
Mm-hmm.
instead try to flip that, come to them and say, hey, I'm trying to get into this industry. You're somebody who's clearly doing amazing work. Can you give me some advice? So,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. Maybe try to not phrase it as like, I'm asking you to do me a favor. It's like, you're fucking awesome. Let me hear more about you. How'd you do it? Right? Tell me your story, right? People love talking about themselves. So I'd say if you hit that angle, you might get a little bit more traction in your
Mm-hmm.
response rate. When it comes to interviews and the process of candidacy, there's definitely stages. And when I work with students and applicants, a lot of times we're trying to just focus on one particular stage because that's where they're having the trouble. So if you're getting the interviews, that's great. It may be different post internship. If you're looking for the full time work, you might experience a different situation. Obviously, this is a tough market right now following several recessions,
Oh yeah.
this is pre recession, but there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of layoffs right now, so there's a larger applicant pool than we're used to. So especially somebody trying to break in, it's tough because you have to fight against everybody who's just got laid off and has some experience. So
Right.
it's a tough market right now. But when you're in there, you want to be like, okay, how am I doing with respect to getting the call back, and how am I
Mm-hmm.
doing with respect to actually passing the interview? Because if the issue is, oh, I'm not getting enough like interviews, then that's a resume cover letter portfolio situation we got to fix. If you're getting the interviews and you're failing them, then okay, let's go hard on your interview skills. Let's try to figure that out. Okay, because it's levels. Let's say gates you got to pass through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That the other thing is I have a friend who we'll talk about after this video, but I would love to recommend you talk to them. So I'm gonna see if I can do an intro on that
For sure. Yeah. Thank
at
you.
some point because I think she will have a lot of information for you. But that's
Okay.
everything that I was just thinking of right there. Uh,
Yeah. That was amazing. Yeah. It was super insightful.
yeah, no problem. So, so do you know? So I want to say something, which is that producers are one of the roles that changes a lot in terms of what they're doing from studio to studio. Like especially in the mobile market, mobile games, they're
Mm-hmm.
like producers often like run the show, and are often in like lead roles. I would say that's definitely like born out of an EA mentality. EA like producers are kind of like honchos on the team,
Mm-hmm.
whereas
Mm-hmm.
like other studios, producers are more like the schedule managers. they're
Mm-hmm.
they're definitely lower on the totem pole of like decision making. So that might be something for you to consider. Is that if you're applying to a certain company, they might be asking a lot more of a producer. They might be asking like for somebody who's like a serious decision maker. And so I would say like the more small the teams are, the more typical like producers are not middle management. So like
Mm-hmm.
at something like um not to say that's not like hey it changes every studio, right? But like in my experience working at like Zynga, the producers, this is like kind of more a larger studio, I'd say, like they're more oriented towards like the decision making versus like smaller studios like Sony Santa Monica. They're more of like the schedule manager types. And
Mm-hmm.
I've worked in a lot of roles across the industry, so that's been my experience. It does vary a lot, so it might be something to keep in mind. I think that might also be a good insightful question as you get to that interview, is sort of asking, expecting like trade offs of like management roles, like, oh, what does a producer do here versus at this other company I was working at? I understand it can vary somewhat. Like you might want to explore that a
Mm-hmm.
bit.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, and this might sound kind of weird, possibly even bad,
Okay.
but I wouldn't mind being that kind of like scheduler, coordinator type role if that meant that I was getting my foot in the door.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes
I'm
100% sense.
ready to be a serious decision maker, of course, too. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. When I was like I was living in LA, and I had a roommate actually who was like a game design grad who was trying to break into design, and he was doing that through QA, which I understand a lot of
Mhm.
people do, particularly production. I would say a lot of the producers I've met in industry have actually come through QA, because that's sort of like production's kind of a, and I don't mean any like negativity on this, but like production's a bit of a soft skill in that it's something
Mhm.
people can pick up a lot more easier than like coding, where you kind of got to take a
Right.
class or like an online course for coding, art similarly. But
Right.
production, I think, just being part of that process and working with Jira and the tools and minding the schedule, you start to pick up some of the skills that a producer would need. Whereas just by being a QA person, you're not going to pick up coding skills or AI skill or animation skills usually, right? Hey, there's always an exception,
Mhm.
but I would say like that. If more than anything, I would say I've seen a lot of QA go into like production, and then second to that, maybe design. Like a bunch of QA
Yeah.
people are like designers.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually, I also had QA as one of my, things I was also looking for as like an entry point. And I will say I don't think I'm above it at all.
Sure.
Not at all, but I would say I would be to be a junior producer slash production coordinator versus QA. I think I'd be more excited to
Right.
be the non QA ones. But that's not a knock against that. It's just that like from what I understand, it wouldn't be playing into my strengths very well.
I mean,
Um,
no. The reality is QA on the team does get paid the least amount. That is the current situation of things, with exceptions of the management in that field and stuff. So yeah, you got to watch out though. QA is not created equally. It
mm,
does vary studio to studio, so you might want to do some research. And also, there's been a lot of shit with QA. QA does get treated like really bad in a lot of companies. So do a Google on various expose articles and Schreier and whatever he's writing about that stuff, because it does vary. Typically, I mean, what you want to look for is in-house QA, okay? Because most, I don't know about most actually. I'm not sure what the demographics, what the like statistics are in this, but like sometimes QA is out of house or even like totally external, which is that they play the game and they send over the bugs and they get hit to producers who are in your studio. But like even if you're like working at the company in office, you're never gonna pass by like a QA guy in that scenario. There's other
mm,
scenarios where the QA is part of the team, they work in the same building, and they feel like they're part of the team and they're regularly chatting with the developers. That's the ideal situation you want, so that you could start building those interpersonal skills and forming relationships with different team members, ideally the ones that you're prospective to join that team, right? But
mhm.
if you're in a situation where you're just working with a bunch of other QA people and you're not getting that cross disciplinary interaction, I think it's going to be harder to like have those skills rub off on you.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but I mean, if you could get into an associate producer role like immediately, that'd be ideal. You
Right,
know,
but
yeah,
competitive
it's
field.
competitive. Yeah, it's competitive. I mean, especially because there's so many like people these days who are coming out of university with degrees and this kind of stuff. They've managed games. You have professional work experience. Maybe it would help to there's so many game devs online. Maybe, or also modding projects, pro modding projects. I
Mm,
definitely feel like that could be a portfolio piece. Is if you go to like one of these big mods for like Fallout New Vegas, right? I know they're doing all the different mods or Fallout 4, all this other mod stuff, right? You could go in there and you could be like, hey guys, I want to help organize your modding team. I've got professional experience. Let me help put the word out about this project you're making, and it just help keep everybody on the same page. This could be
mhm,
a quick little, I don't know, maybe a few hours a week project that you just invest in, and then you've got it on your resume, right? Particularly something like very prestigious, like some of these big modding projects, especially if you're applying to the studio that's doing the stuff that's related to the mod, right? Like, let's say I'm coming into, let's say the biggest mod for Fallout is Fallout, um, Florida, or what is it called? Like, I forget the name, but there's like some big
mhm,
mod like there, like Fallout Florida or something like that. And then it's like you apply to Bethesda or whatever it is, and you're like, yeah, and I'm also one of the producers on the lead mod project for your game. It's like, oh wow, they sound like they
mhm.
belong here, right?
Wow,
Um,
yeah.
I always say to candidates when they're applying to the interview that when they're evaluating your social skills, they want to see, is this somebody who belongs on the team, right?
Mhm,
And the more that you could do to make it feel like, oh, it's destiny, like this guy's one of us already, then that's great shit. So I will say a little parable from when I was applying to university. Back in the day, I would go to they'd have like this interview where you meet like somebody who was an alumnus of the school, right? And so I'd
Right.
say to them, oh, I've got, and there's lies sometimes, or let's say equivocation, right? But you say,
Yeah.
oh, I love to visit my friend at Columbia. He's just, I just go into New York City, and he actually would invite me to some of the lectures with the professor. So I've sat in on Professor Bob Joe's course, and I've had such a great time there. And interacting with the student body, I really love the culture, right? So you can say some bullshit like that, right? And it's like, oh wow, he belongs here. He's already part of the community, right? And like to the degree that you could do that with the game dev stuff, like maybe modding is like a way to get in there. GDC as well. GDC, you're gonna want to try to get into the parties, right? So try to get into as many parties as possible. You may know about that already, but that's important. And make friends, and I don't know, collect business cards or LinkedIn or whatever it is, and try to keep up to date with those people, right? Try not to just say, oh, I met him and I shook his hand. That counts, right? Try to get some contact info, and then like within a few days or a week, be like, wow, I had a great time. I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that story you told me, to learn a little bit more about what it was like to do that thing. Would you be free for like, to do a coffee chat or something? I'll buy you, maybe even say, hey, it might work, right? Incentivize and be like, oh, I'll buy you a coffee, or like, oh man, I'll give you a Starbucks gift card, just for half an hour of your time. I'd love to pick your brain about some bullshit, right? And that, like, little stuff like that, to start building those connections, right? Because like it'll help, and it is a small industry too, right? Like I've definitely like maybe I've said stuff in the past and like I've regretted it, and it's like, oh man, like if that ever happens, like it's a very small industry, so you got to watch out too, like and like as you said before, like people could be very sensitive, so maybe people will be offended by stuff, so you got to watch out, right? I'm definitely I'm like a very forthcoming person, right? So if like I say, oh, like this is shit, like people would they'll cry, so you got to watch out.
It's okay. Sorry, one moment.
Yeah,
Having
no
a
worries.
slight difficulty.
It's all good.
Siri, please stop.
This is my Alexa. She always
Stopping. Okay, here we go. It's gone. Two things I want to mention just as a disclaimer. My Google Meet has alerted me that my internet is unstable.
Okay.
So hopefully it hangs in there till the end of this.
Sure.
Two, sorry about Siri. I don't know. She just gets activated when she hears anything that sounds like, hey, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So yeah.
So what else do you want to talk about?
Yeah, so there's there's so many points I could touch upon in terms of what I'm really fascinated or curious about. I have been asking a few people about mentorship in smaller gaming studios versus bigger ones, because I had this assumption that mentorship wouldn't be as readily available in smaller companies due to limited resources. And I had a few people, some checked me on that, and some were like, oh, I don't know. And I'd be curious if you could like be able to weigh in on that in terms of like wanting someone, and I can define mentorship for me as not necessarily like teaching me the direct skills or positionality of a role, but just having the like a structure for like weekly check-ins on how projects are going and whatnot and things like that. And I guess I was a little worried that especially as a femme minority in this space, like without mentorship I wouldn't make it very far. What are your thoughts about that, mentorship in smaller versus bigger companies?
Well, I think mentorship is very important. I love Lean In by I forget her name, the woman from Facebook.
Yeah, Sheryl Sandberg.
Sandberg, yeah. Love her, right? She's so fucking cool, right? And I think a lot of people got pissed off when she wrote that book, though, because everybody was like, you keep asking for mentorship, right? Like this became like a bit of a thing. Like, what does that even mean? And I have seen some posts of people who are like, don't ask me to be your mentor, because it's just a little bit too amorphous for somebody to feel comfortable like signing up for. Like, what am I even agreeing to, right? I'd say mentorship's really important, but maybe don't ever call it for what it is. Maybe try to call it by something else. Ask for advice on a certain thing. I'd say never meet with somebody as a check-in. I'd say always bring them a problem to chew on, because people who are busy, they like to solve problems. So, and they like to feel like they're being helpful. So I actually did have a few mentors in the beginning of my career who were amazing. I'd say maybe 3 people who I met mostly through the Stanford Alumni Network, and I reached out to them, and I never did check-ins, and frankly, I'm just bad in general at keeping up with people. I know this is something I'm working on with even just my friends now, right? But I'm somebody who I like problem solving, and I think that's important too. Like, yeah, I mean, some people like to meet up, right? But the people who do like to meet up don't mind having a problem to fix. The people who don't like chatting bullshit, they don't like it if you don't have a problem to bring to them. They're like, "What is this? We're chatting bullshit." So yeah, everybody's different, right? But I would say it never hurts to come with something to chew on. So I never reached out to my mentors unless I had a problem to chew on, and even if I already had an idea of what I was going to do, I went to them and I said, "Hey, here's my idea," even over just email. And I said, "Hey, free to chat if you want to phone call, catch up, see how everything's been." So I think it's super valuable. I totally recommend doing it. I think people are going to feel uncomfortable saying, "Yeah, I'll be your mentor." I think instead, lean into it. Maybe this is somebody who you've gone to 1 or 2 times for advice, and then suddenly a relationship builds. But you never need to call it anything more than that, because I think people are a little phobic of this lexicon. So when it comes to mentorship, I found that it doesn't happen naturally. There are some companies that follow what's called the matrix management approach, which is that they're not going to give you just one manager who's in charge of your professional performance, your tasking, and your interpersonal relationships / career growth. They'll instead give you 3 managers, perhaps, one of each discipline. That's the case, I believe, at Epic Games and at, I believe, Bungie. But most companies will give you just one manager, and that person is your tasker, and that person is your evaluator, and he's going to be giving you the PIP if you're not doing so well. And that is also the person who you've got to go to for career aspiration. Of course, nice perhaps to have somebody for everything, but ultimately maybe not the best thing, because one, you might not feel comfortable talking to them about all those 3 things, right? If you don't like them, shit out of luck, right? Because now you've got one guy you've got to go to for 3 things. And also, they do have conflicting motivations. The guy who needs to get your tasks done is not the guy who's going to want you to think about progressing your career to the next team, because shit, then I lose my amazing producer, Garcia. What am I going to do to fill that slot, right? So there's a conflict of interest there, which is why typically you do want to invest time into having, even if the company doesn't support it, in law, you want to go out of your way to build that matrix manager network, because your managers, they're going to have that conflict when it comes to that kind of stuff, right? So I'd say keep that in mind. I would say, yeah, definitely leaning into the diversities stuff is good, because I don't think just like, "Oh, hey, help me out," is always it is what it is if that's what it is, right? But I'd say, like, if your company or within the industry, if you could join some sort of group that's like, "Hey, women in games," or Latinos in games, I know both of those exist, then that's a really good way to sort of start building those relationships. And whenever you meet somebody, ask about that thing. One thing that I love doing is it's the truth that, like, there are mavens in any industry, which is to say people who are centroid nodes in graphs. So if you meet somebody, they might be the middle of a big graph, but you don't know, right? And so what I always do is I meet somebody and I say, "Hey, who do you recommend to talk to about this kind of stuff?" And they'll give you 3 names. And then, you meet those 3 people and you say, "Hey, who do you recommend to talk to about this stuff?" Same question, right? And they'll give you 3 names. And you'll notice that a lot of the names repeat. And those are the people you want to be talking to, because those are the centers of those graphs, right? And it may be localized. You might never get the name of somebody who's really great because he's in a different graph, right? But like with respect to the social graph, you'll like whenever I start a new job at work, I'm like, hey, let me meet with all the people on the team. But then I'll say, hey, who do you recommend I talk to? Who's a really great person to learn from? And it a lot of times it always starts pointing to the same like key people, and you're like, okay, those are the key. Those are people who are like coaches, and also those are people who are receptive to talking to people, because there's a lot of people who are great in our industry, but as independent contributors, they're not necessarily people who like talking, and that might not be the best coach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, I will say like the point about women in games has been very valid in that I went on the website, looked at their ambassadors, and I reached out to everyone who was in San Diego and who I just had a feeling maybe would respond to me, which is an interesting subjective feeling. But I started the message with like, hey, I was on the Women in Games website, see your ambassador. I'm also in San Diego, blah, blah. I tried to like make those connector points, and every single one of those people that I reached out to from that kind of like positioning, like responded and has like talked with me. And so I think that has been like, that's a really helpful point for sure, because it definitely does work to have those affinities, but then also to just directly mention them, especially if it's an organizational affinity. I don't know so much about like, like informally mentioning the affinity. That might be a little interesting to some people. I don't know if you know what I'm kind of referring to, but like being like, I see that we're both not men in the gaming industry.
Oh, I see. Yeah, maybe not do that. Yeah.
But if they're a woman in games and they're an ambassador, it's a lot better, I think, to say.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm saying look at existing orgs,
Mm-hmm.
If that affinity is there, or something in common, then, it'll probably be unspoken, and people they'll get it,
For sure.
So, meetups. There's a bunch, right? Meetup.com. Look up game dev meetups in your area if you want to start. That's a great way to network, especially because like face to face is a great way to meet people. San Diego is such a hot scene. I'm thinking of LA. I don't know how close those are, but
2 hours.
2 hours. Okay, yeah, maybe if you got a car and you want to go for it,
Mm-hmm.
because I know I used to work at Sony Santa Monica, and I went to their LA scene, and it was popping. There was a bunch of people there. Other stuff you might want to look at is like Unity meetup. Like these are Unity developers, so like it's not just a game dev meetup. It may be technical in nature, but it could be a good place to talk to people and hang out with folks. Could be very indie leaning, perhaps. I know a lot of those events draw indie crowds, and you're interested in people who could hire a producer, which is larger teams, AAA, let's say, but could still be useful, perhaps.
For sure. No, that's super helpful.
Yeah, GDC is great too. They do have mentoring slots you could sign up for. I recommend you do.
See, my brother was looking at the website for me when I was like considering buying a pass, and he found something about like the mentorship slots, and then we like couldn't find it again, or he said he couldn't find it again. So I don't know if you ever like if you have that link readily available and like can send it. Like you don't? Okay, no worries. I will find it then.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if the website's shitty, then harass the committee. Be like, guys, I'm not signing up for this, and it's like it's annoying.
I think my brother.
Maybe they filled up slots or something. I doubt it though. I'd say, and sometimes you go there and it's like there are people. I remember this. Like there are people sitting at tables, and they're like, anybody who wants to go up, go. Right. So it might not be a plan ahead kind of thing. It might just be like, this is as I recall, there was like a cordoned region with tables and chairs, and people who had signed up as mentors. I think they go for X amount of hours, like maybe each person does half an hour or something. They sit down, and then anybody who wants to come comes, right, or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense too. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely remember super long lines at GDC for like artist portfolio reviews. Like you could get in a long line, and maybe wait half an hour or an hour. You finally get to the end of the desk, and there's like 3 pros who are there to like review your portfolio, tell you how to make it better. Which I mean is worth money, something like that. So it's worth sitting. It's definitely worth doing that if you want to spend the time to do that. If you're meeting with people in this video chat capacity, I don't know. Maybe if the relationship's going well in your video chat, you could say, hey, do you have any advice for my portfolio? Here's a link. You want any tips, right? I mean, you got to suss that out. Or you could even say, do you know? So you could say, hey, here's my portfolio. These are the kind of skills I'm looking at. Do you have any advice on what kind of studio would be a good fit for me, or any positions
Mm,
you know of that might be a good role for my kind of skills going into this? And
mm-hmm.
1 time out of 10, they might say, oh shit, we actually have an opening on our team that's coming up. This would be a great fit, right? You may have heard the statistic, as it's true, that a lot of jobs get filled before the post ever goes up, and they've got to like put the post up as a formality, but they've already got a candidate in mind. So like, there's definitely
Yeah.
like an internal job search network kind of thing going on there. So I'd keep it in mind.
Yeah. No, that's smart for sure. Um, yeah, someone I met with was a senior producer at Amazon Games, and it was like we were having a great conversation, and she did the thing where she pulled up my LinkedIn and like started like giving feedback even without me asking, which I thought
Right.
was great. I was like, then it was one less thing for me to have to like build the guts up to ask
Right.
about. And like I'm like still taking that feedback and planning to implement. But then I got to the end of the conversation, and it was a great, like super like friendly and like fun conversation. But then I was like, I forgot to say, what do you look for in a junior producer or like an associate producer? And like that would have been so helpful just to get it like straight from her mouth, like what she's looking for. Not like necessarily be like, oh, like hire me, but like just to know, because that I was still in the discovery phase then. And I just didn't know enough. So
Yeah.
I felt like that was also one of the things I could have built upon in my conversation, was just straight up being like, what do you look for in these roles for like associate roles?
Yeah,
Uh,
it's a good question, though. I would highly recommend you target it to be a personal question. So
mhm.
I would rephrase that question as, when you were first starting out in the industry as an associate producer, what are the skills you wish you had coming in? That
Mm,
I they will that will trigger a good part in their mind, and they will say,
mm,
"Oh, it's about me. It's my story." And then you can say, oh, from typical applicants, do you see that they've got that, or what are they lacking? Right? Like,
mm.
then you go generic, but start personal, because people want personal questions.
I agree.
Yeah,
That's super,
because
super smart.
she's heard the first one before, but not the second one. Like, she hasn't heard
Yeah,
the question about herself. She'll care about that more.
yeah, for sure, for sure. And then I got like, so that was like a thing, a retrospective that I had in my own mind. But then another piece of feedback that I got in terms of going into these informational chats with folks was I like practiced my like opening, not like I wouldn't call it a pitch, but it was like my opening about me like spiel with my friend. And he was just like, you are literally talking for the first 5 minutes like about yourself, which I think kind of relates to what you're saying about like people wanting to like it's better to have the expert probably be talking about their trajectory, their work, give a little bit about yourself. But I felt like he really led me in the right direction by saying that, like, okay, your pitch here or whatever, your spiel, it's just like you talking about yourself and not like asking questions that are like about the person themselves. I don't know if that like also sounds like kind of like good feedback that you would give as well, or if you would add anything to that. But I changed like my framing dramatically from like my practice feel with him to when I met with someone else, who I was actually like who I was practicing for.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I think that's great that you're practicing your informational interviews. I think that's great. I'd say the next step there might be to record it and
mm,
just hear it back, maybe at 2 times speed, save yourself some time, and just imagine, I am the other person. Is this person boring me? You know, and
mm.
just think like, oh, okay, is this useful? Do they sound like they are obsessed with themselves or something like that? Um, but it sounds like you're already taking a very conscientious approach to that kind of stuff if you're doing practices. So I think that's great. My mistake usually, like when I interview people, they'll always say to me like, "Oh, Matthew, I learned. I've talked so much about me. I haven't learned anything about you." And they never say this, right? But like, this is their sentiment, and this felt very transactional. I felt almost
Mhm.
interrogated, because you asked me so many questions, but like, I didn't really learn anything about you. It felt so one way, And people don't like that, right? It feels unnatural. So in your case, they were giving feedback, hey, it felt like, or you were saying, oh, it's all one way from me. In my case, it was all one way to me. So maybe the nuance or the lesson there is we want it to feel like a flow of conversation, right? We want some back and forth. So I guess,
Right.
yeah, just you know, if I'm talking too much, shut up. If you're not talking enough, then find something they said that connects with you or that you have in common, and then say, oh, this is like what I had, but this was in a way in which it was different from me, and then maybe they'll think that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, this is all super helpful. I think it's interesting that people might like look at this and be like, "Wow, Vanessa is learning basic conversation skills." But I think that's for me. It is part of like me having to understand like the nuances of framing, of positionality, and also just practice. That I think these are really important points because like as I mentioned, like being being neurodivergent, it doesn't actually come super naturally to me. And so for me, it is like it might seem like to others like this is this is basic common sense, but it's actually not.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't think most people are like as conscientious about it. So I think going into it with some intentionality is great.
yeah,
I think that's a good thing, and the more because you know what the thing is, a lot of people fail these like soft skill questions because they prepare for the hard math, and
yeah,
they fail the other tests, right? So it's all it's all a factor. So I don't think it's at all a waste of time to invest in thinking, oh, do I come across as somebody who cares about them?
yeah.
It matters, right? People care about that
I
stuff.
would hope so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not sure how much time you had left. I just wanted to be conscientious of
Sure.
like
Yeah,
your
I
time.
could go to the hour, top of the hour, so
Okay,
10 minutes.
got it. Yeah, perfect, perfect. And I actually wanted to go back to something that you touched upon earlier in terms of like kind of my my possible process at GDC, in terms of you know the follow-ups with people, not just getting that handshake and then like dipping. I kind of posed this question, or I want to pose this question to a few people, but I want to pose it to you. How an aspiring gaming PM or producer or etc. How do they go to these conferences if they don't have their own game or current gaming role in the most appropriate sense? And the reason why I'm really hitting hard on this is because I just feel I don't want to be like, oh, I'm so nervous to go, because like that's a little simplified of like what's going on here. I just think that when people see my badge and they don't see like a company there, and then also I'm not like, oh, I built my own game, which I would actually love to do. I don't have like the resources to get there yet. How do I kind of most appropriately position myself in that space to kind of, I don't know, just at least I want to have a good time. Like I don't want to take myself too seriously, but at the same time I do want to make sure that I'm just taking um, taking advantage of the opportunity that I've invested in. So I'm kind of like, that's what I've been ruminating on this one. Don't have a game, don't have a current gaming role, but I'm at this conference. Like,
Right.
what? What?
Right. Okay. Before I answer that question, something just popped into my mind, and I wanted to mention it to you. I'm going to show it on the screen now, but you're not going to see this. But you know what? I'll send you a link.
Okay.
A friend of mine from Sony Santa Monica, we had worked together. Her name is Estelle Tagani. She has a public website, which I just sent you in the chat, and she's a producer for Sony Santa Monica. She has a bunch of really cool stuff on her website about like what her story was, and she interviewed a bunch of people in the the games industry, so she got advice from them, and she kind of gathered some of her advice. Like I can see here's an essay she wrote about mentorship. Um,
Mm,
so I think all that would be very useful for you. So I would check out
yeah.
her website because she's a I think she like became a producer, so it might be an interesting path. Um,
Yeah.
but you were talking about GDC. I don't think you're alone. I think there's a lot of people who are in that situation where like they've got not a job just yet, and so they want to meet other people and just socialize. And I think there's a good amount of stuff for that. I mean, I'm kind of like not a very extroverted person, so I had trouble at GDC because it felt like everybody had gone with their buddies, and I was like, oh man, like besides hanging out with some of my friends, when they left to go do a talk or something I wasn't interested in, I was like, oh, I guess I'm like all here all alone, and everybody just wants to talk to each other that they already know. Because for a lot of people, this is like their catch up. Because it's like, oh, they're in all these studios spread across the country, so like now they come together, they want to meet their own buds and like catch up. But I'm like, oh man, I feel so lonely. So I think like you should realize that, and then you gotta be like, fuck it, I've got to go out and meet people. Like you gotta just be the guy who comes up to the random dude at the coffee machine and is like, hey, how's it going? My name's Matthew. Like you just gotta do it, right? Like it's gonna feel, at least for me, it's tough. That kind of stuff's tough because I'm kind of like introverted, but you just gotta do it. You gotta put on the show and maybe pretend or something like that you're somebody who feels comfortable with that, because you just gotta do it. So I think that helps. You're sitting down for a talk to the guy to your left, talk to the guy to your right. Don't just go sit down and watch the presentation, because it's all about the people you meet. So you really got to push yourself, and you might do it in the first 3 times, or you might have a bad experience and you're like, oh, I don't want to do it anymore. No, you got to keep doing it. You got to keep saying hello and meeting people, because that's what it's about. So yeah, it feels uncomfortable for me, at least. This is my own experience. But some people it comes naturally. But for me, it's like, it's a grind every time. I have to go out of my way to be like, hello, but you got to do it. You got to just do it. So I would recommend that.
I agree.
What? Yeah, and I think there's definitely like more events that are like catered to that. But I would there's like websites I think that map like GDC parties. But if not, just Google like GDC events, GDC parties. There's always like a Discord that has stuff posted. Get on that Discord, figure out what events people are going to, because you'll find that a lot of the official GDC events are very, like, they're like a talk, and you're not going to have a conversation with somebody in the middle of a presentation, maybe before, maybe after, but other than that, it's going to be like that. But GDC, you've got to think about your key networking time as like, okay, the GDC has ended. Now is all like the events and after parties and stuff, and this is when I've got to go and make friends, and that's tough. And part of the day's work is figuring out what party's going on and then going to those events. You have a good connection with somebody. Say, hey, what are you guys doing later tonight? I was planning to go to this event. It sounded cool. Do you want to come, or do you know of something else that's happening? Maybe go with them, right? Like it's work, but you got to do that, right? If you're at GDC and it's like a long night and you just finish and you're like, oh, I'm gonna go back to my hotel room after the conversations and I'm just gonna have a good meal to myself and sleep, then no, you failed, right? That's terrible. You need to go out and you need to push yourself, and like, maybe don't do alcohol if you don't want to do alcohol, right? But just you try to break out of your comfort zone. And of course, everybody's there for something different. But I do think there's so much value to be had in these sort of like spurious relationships that you should try to orient your schedule to like, okay, let me try to do that as much as I can.
Yeah. I think it's, I know we're running up on time, but I just like from like a personal perspective or like an assessment of myself, I do enjoy being pretty extroverted. I just have like that inferiority complex, which is like an interesting mix.
Sure, yeah.
I love talking to people, love being around people, but I'm always like, I should not be talking to this person because blah, blah, blah. Like, it's just so weird.
Yeah, no, but I just made a video about this on my channel because it is so common, and I've experienced it too. This sometimes they call it the imposter syndrome is sometimes what it's called.
Right.
But I mean, the quickest way out of imposter syndrome is basically, because imposter syndrome is you're pretending to be something you're not. So just pretend to be what you are. If you think you suck, then say, oh, I suck, but I'm getting better, right? That's just how you got to do it. You got to face it head on.
Yeah.
So you go to them and you say, hey, I'm somebody who's learning about this thing. I'm a huge fan of your game. Tell me about this thing, right? And it's like, people love talking about themselves, so that's always the angle you want to take. And it's like, just maybe you might say, oh, I don't deserve their time, so be courteous and ask a question, and maybe if you want to be like Estelle, right? She writes a blog, so it's like, oh, I've got viewership, right? Who reads that blog? Probably no one. No offense to
Yeah.
Estelle, right? But it's like, it's the same. Like I might make a YouTube video and it gets like 10 views, right? It's like, but I could say, oh, I'm doing this to share the knowledge, right? The viewership, right? So if that's a little bit of a head fake, you've got to think to yourself to get in there, like, oh, I've got some friends who are graduating from university, and they wanted me to ask this question to you. It's like I'm just here for them, man. Like you can do that, like
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
it is, right? Because maybe you lie to yourself to psych yourself up, whatever the bullshit is, right?
Yeah.
Just do it so you can get there and ask the question. That's what has to happen.
For sure. And I just want to say, like, people that are putting these resources out there, it's incredibly helpful for folks like me. So, like, I just feel like, I don't know. I mean, now that they're out there, I can peruse it on like my convenience and then learn a lot. So I don't know.
So why the game development industry?
You want me to end on this?
Well, because I always tell people don't do it. So
don't do it.
Always, yeah. Especially.
Wait, can you tell me why that first, and then I'll answer?
It's not a good job. Game dev.
It's not a good job. Okay.
No, I don't think so. Especially as an engineer, you'll work less hours and get paid maybe double somewhere else, right? Especially if you can hack it, right? Like I've worked at like some premier studios, and it's like, if you could work at like Google, you're gonna have a better life if you can find as much enjoyment, right? Like for me and a lot of the people, I do think like, oh damn, like, if I could be as happy somewhere else, I would, right? But the thing is, I can't, right? Because I just love the artistry, and like that's kind of what draws me. But I always recommend it to people, to somebody who's just like poking their toe in the industry. I always say, give some other stuff a really good shot, because the truth is, like, if you're a coder and you could be as happy making Chase banking software, fuck, man, if you think that's cool, do that. You're gonna have so much more fun. Because yeah, it's not the like lifespan in this industry is very low compared to others. Yeah.
That's helpful to know. I do think I'm still really excited to try my hand at this, just because of conceptually understanding it as world building. I think, like, in my previous experiences in both product and then being a very junior producer for like a small collective, I just think that the world building aspect of it and getting to be part of something bigger than yourself, from what I observed, has been really appealing to me. And I just think that for me, in my particular position, where I would be taking something all the way from its brainstorming phases to its full on launch and getting to be in the middle of that, from the beginning to the end, that has been a great experience in healthcare. But for gaming, I could just see it being a lot better. And I don't feel like, I don't know how to say this. Healthcare for me, and this is a very, like, I guess, like, for like, this is a me comment. I kind of ended up there on accident, whereas with gaming, I feel like this could be a lot more intentional.
Sure.
And that's why I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, right? Man search for meaning, right? It's like, if that's you've done the corp stuff, and you're like, oh man, it's not giving me this fulfillment perhaps in my soul, then you get it, right? And like, that's what draws people to art, And it's like, hey, if you could find a hobby that fulfills that, and hey, I'm just one guy, right? So everybody has a different thing, right? But like, if you could find this hobby that brings the warmth to your heart, then this is like amazing, right? Because like, to do it as a job can sometimes be tough, right? Because it's tough to make art. Art is very tough, especially in a recession, because it's inherently unnecessary. So that's why it's tough. And of course, my good friend Scott would be heartbroken if I didn't mention that, for some people it is actually very necessary. It's truth that in times of our greatest peril, right, it's art that brings us through. So of course this is true, right? But yeah, I'd say, you always you gotta beware, right? And definitely beware of all the bad stuff in the games industry. Look up EA spouse, know about that.
Okay, I will look that up.
Yeah. So there's tough stuff, but yeah, I mean, if you love it, you love it, and I love it, and so many other people do love it, and they call it home. So it is what it is.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So.
Yeah. There was one other thing, but I forgot.
That's okay. All good.
Right. So, I think that's time. Is there any other final things you want to talk about? Can't wait.
Honestly, this was super. I have like 4 pages of like just notes going in every which direction.
Awesome.
So that's always super helpful for me. I just feel like, yeah, we touched on a lot of things in this conversation that are, are insightful, but also it's making me want to chew on something a little bit longer with like before, like the GDC thing was really helpful, but now I'm like, okay, like there's just like some internal questions that I now have. Like it's funny how the questions just lead to more questions sometimes. Sure. And so that's where I'm like, okay, now I'm going to go sit with myself and just like think and pivot and like, kind of like think about how like some questions can be transformed. Like when I asked the mentorship question again, I'm not going to say mentorship, like for example. So yeah, like this was really informative, really insightful. And I just feel like I think I know what I'm doing. I'm not going to say I know what I'm doing, and because I don't, but I think I know what I'm doing. So
awesome. Well, hey, it was great talking to you, Vanessa. Let me know if you learned something that you think is salient wisdom for new folks, right? Because I'd love to add it to the book and the other guides I'm working on. I work a lot with candidates, and I want to help them.
Yeah,
I
for sure.
Awesome stuff. And
for sure.
Yeah, and I'll catch you later. All right. It's clear you're coming at this with a lot of intentionality and conscientiousness, so I'm sure great things are gonna happen. And I'm getting a call, so I've got to jump out to my next.
Yes. All right. Bye.
I'll see you. Bye.